November 8, 1942, Sidi Farouk Beach, Algeria. The first waves of American infantry crashed through the surf under a pale dawn rifles raised high to keep them dry, hearts pounding louder than the artillery echoing inland. The air is thick with salt spray and smoke from naval guns, a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, clinging to every man who steps onto the sand. Behind them, crates marked "Secret" are being dragged ashore, boxes so ordinary in appearance that no one suspects they carry a weapon destined to change the face of modern war. Most of these soldiers have no idea what waits inside, nor that history is shifting with every step they take. As the battle rages, the irony cuts deep. The Germans have rolled out steel beast tanks that have terrorized Europe since 1940, machines that once seemed unstoppable. Against them, the Americans arrive not with heavier cannons or thicker armor, but with hollow tubes of steel and rockets barely tested in training fields back home. It is a gamble bordering on madness. Farmers' sons and factory workers turn soldiers expected to face panzers. With a device so new, some still call it a toy. One young lieutenant watches the shoreline erupt with fire, clutching the strange weapon for the first time, its crude sights fashioned from bent wire. His fear collides with a flicker of defiance. Could this unproven invention really stand against the monsters of German engineering? The question hangs over the beach like the smoke drifting inland. In that moment of chaos and disbelief, the story begins not with a tank charge or a general's order, but with a simple tube that would force the world's most feared armored divisions to fight differently forever. The dawn at Sidi Farouk fades from view. But the story of the strange weapon the soldiers carried ashore begins months earlier, far from the smoke of battlefields and the roar of tank engines. It begins not in some state-of-the-art factory or guarded laboratory, but at a proving ground in Maryland, with little more than a steel tube pulled from a scrap pile and a vision of changing the impossible into the possible. On May 6, 1942, the Aberdeen Proving Ground stood restless under gray skies. Officers and engineers gathered to watch demonstrations of new anti-tank weapons, the air buzzing with anticipation and skepticism alike. War had already shown that tanks were the iron kings of the battlefield, chewing through infantry with merciless precision. America needed something that could give its foot soldiers a fighting chance. On the schedule were weapons that bore all the hallmarks of modern military design: massive spigot mortars, heavy contraptions, built with complexity and tradition in mind. Devices requiring teams of men and months of training to master. But then came the anomaly, a weapon so crude it looked like an afterthought, a joke compared to the polished machines around it. Lieutenant Edward Uhl stepped forward, cradling the odd creation. It was nothing more than a seamless steel tube, the kind any factory worker might discard as useless. The sights bent wire from an old coat hanger twisted with pliers into rough alignment. There was no weight of prestige, no aura of technological sophistication. To the generals assembled, it must have seemed insulting, this cobbled-together pipe daring to stand beside the giants of artillery. Colonel Leslie Skinner watched quietly, knowing that in the face of ridicule, sometimes genius wore the mask of absurdity. The demonstration began with the British-designed mortars. Crews struggled adjusting levers, sweating over their complicated systems. From 150 yards, they aimed at a moving M3 Stuart tank, its engine humming like a predator circling prey. Shells fired one after another, thunder echoing across the range. Dirt plumes rose, smoke curled into the wind, but the tank rolled on untouched. 5 shots, 5 failures. The mortars, intricate and respected, had proven clumsy and blind. The officers shifted uneasily, the promise of an answer slipping away. Then Uhl lifted the steel tube onto his shoulder. He wore a welder's mask, an almost comic image that hid his uncertainty. He didn't know if the blast might sear his face, if the crude connections would fail catastrophically. The generals leaned back, half expecting a farce. But then came the hiss, the sudden whoosh of propulsion. A rocket screamed out of the tube, slicing across the range, and slammed into the Stuart's side with a crack that turned heads and stilled the crowd. Smoke curled from the impact armor, scarred. Before the shock could fade, Uhl reloaded a motion so fast it seemed instinctual and fired again. Another direct hit. Silence hung in the proving ground. The absurd had become undeniable. General Gladion Barnes, chief of research and engineering, strode forward, inspecting the blackened steel tube as though it had betrayed every rule of military design he knew. And then he laughed. "It looks like Bob Burns's bazooka," he quipped, naming the radio comedian's homemade musical instrument. The joke became a christening. And in that moment, the nameless tube of steel became the bazooka. What followed was urgency, the kind that only war can create. Within minutes, Barnes ordered 5,000 units for immediate production. The simplicity of the design was its miracle. No rare alloys, no intricate machining, no need for craftsmen skilled in obscure arts. Just steel welding and a few electrical contacts. Any factory in America could produce them and soon would. General Electric and other contractors transformed their assembly lines, spitting out bazookas by the thousands within weeks. From prototype to mass production in mere months, a pace unheard of in military procurement, the bazooka was born not as a marvel of perfection, but as a child of necessity and improvisation. But the weapon's humble birth carried more than technical significance. It carried a philosophy. Where others sought power in size and complexity, America had found strength in accessibility. A weapon light enough for 2 men to carry, simple enough to master in an afternoon, yet lethal enough to punch through inches of armor. It democratized destruction, giving ordinary soldiers the means to confront tanks that had once reduced infantry to frightened prey. Still, in those early days, no one could truly know the scale of what had just been unleashed. To some, it was still a gamble, an untested idea thrown against the iron certainty of German armor. Yet to others it was proof that ingenuity and daring could rewrite the rules of war. The officers who had watched spigot mortars fail and a scrap metal tube succeed left Aberdeen with something more than a report. They carried the seed of revolution in their briefcases and orders in their hands. Factories roared to life sparks flying from welders' torches, steel tubes stacked like cordwood waiting to be transformed. Crates were stamped secret filled with launchers and rockets and dispatched to ports under guard. The weapon that had been cobbled together from junkyard, metal, and coat hangers was now a national priority. A project born in obscurity, but bound for beaches, mountains, and hedgerows, where young men would bet their lives on its promise. And so, from that proving ground in Maryland, the bazooka began its march toward history. What started as a desperate improvisation mocked as a toy had proven its worth in fire. It would soon leave the safety of demonstrations and laboratories to face the chaos of real combat, where misfires, confusion, and untrained hands would test whether this strange invention could deliver on its promise. The leap from theory to battlefield was a chasm, and the men who would carry the bazooka into war would not cross it without sacrifice. For now, though, the order was clear: build them fast, build them cheap, and put them into the hands of every soldier who would soon face the armored monsters of the Axis. The gamble had been made. The seed had been planted. The simple steel tube had proven itself worthy of a place in America's arsenal. From a scrap pile to a proving ground, from ridicule to revelation, the bazooka was ready to step onto the world stage. Ahead lay uncertainty, failure, and triumph, but one truth was already undeniable: the battlefield would never be the same again. The crates marked secret that had left Aberdeen now sat on the decks of transport ships rolling in the swells of the Atlantic. Inside were thousands of crude launchers and rockets hastily manufactured, packed with hope but also uncertainty. By November 8, 1942, when American troops stormed the beaches of North Africa in Operation Torch, the bazooka had moved from experiment to battlefield. Yet the leap from proving ground to war would prove far harsher than the generals imagined. On the night before the landings, General Eisenhower discovered an astonishing oversight. The men slated to carry this new weapon into combat had never been trained to use it. The orders had been strict: the crates were not to be opened until the invasion began. Secrecy had been valued more than preparation. So when the weapons were finally unboxed on the sand of Algeria, soldiers stared at them like strange relics from another world. Some fumbled with the batteries, others tried to jam damp rockets into corroded contacts. The manuals were missing, the training absent. And over their confusion loomed the silhouettes of tanks. The 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment reported the bitter reality first. Of the first 20 rockets they fired in anger, only 7 worked. Moisture from the sea voyage had seeped into the rockets, ruining propellant and detonators. Some launchers sparked but failed to fire, leaving men exposed as enemy armor advanced. Others fired only for the rockets to streak wildly into the sand or explode prematurely. For soldiers already facing the terror of war, the betrayal of their new weapon cut deep. What had been promised as salvation now seemed like a cruel trick. In the battle logs of the 1st Infantry Division, the frustration is palpable. Weapon failed to function as intended. Operators unfamiliar. Losses sustained. These were not the triumphant words anyone had expected. On beaches littered with wreckage, American infantry crouched low, clutching rifles too weak to pierce tank armor, wondering if the strange tubes on their shoulders were worth the weight. The Germans had rolled across Europe with blitzkrieg. Now the Americans, supposedly armed with innovation, looked like children fumbling with toys. And yet within this mess of failure, sparks of promise appeared. Near Port Lyautey, anti-tank teams from the 1st Armored Division managed to position themselves in narrow streets where 2 Renault tanks rumbled forward under the Vichy French flag. The Bazooka team braced fired, and to their shock the rocket screamed true. One tank burst into flame, its crews scrambling out in panic. The second soon followed, struck on the side armor at close range. The after-action report was cautious. Weapon effective when functioning properly, but between the lines, a seed of belief had been planted. Still, the early failures weighed heavier than the victories. Rumors spread among the ranks that the rockets were cursed, that the tubes were more dangerous to the men firing them than to the enemy. Soldiers joked darkly that they'd rather throw the rockets by hand. For every successful kill, 2 or 3 attempts fizzled or misfired, and when lives depended on certainty, doubt became poison. The Germans noticed too. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, when Rommel's Afrika Korps smashed through American lines, they overran depots and positions where bazookas had been left behind. In the chaos of retreat, crates of launchers and stacks of rockets fell into German hands. To American soldiers, it felt like insult upon injury. Their weapon had failed them in battle, and now it was being shipped off to Berlin to be dissected. In Germany, engineers pored over the captured launchers with cold efficiency. Their reports were blunt, simple to build, easy to use, capable of defeating 80 millimeters of armor at 100 meters. They immediately began work on their own version, enlarging the warhead and adapting it to their production lines. By the fall of 1943, the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck would stalk the same battlefields where the bazooka first stumbled. America's secret was no longer its own. Yet failure has a way of sharpening necessity. For the American ordnance teams, the North African experience was a brutal lesson. Rockets needed better seals to withstand ocean voyages. Electrical contacts required redesign to resist corrosion. Soldiers needed manuals, drills, practice time to learn how to aim, reload, and fire without hesitation. Commanders demanded fixes, and engineers listened. Out of the frustration, new versions were born, sturdier, deadlier, more reliable. In hindsight, those first weeks in North Africa looked like disaster, but they were more than that. They were the crucible in which the bazooka's true potential was tested, not in theory but in blood and smoke. The failures forced improvements that no proving ground could have revealed. They exposed the gap between invention and application, between genius on paper and survival in combat. For the men on the beaches and in the desert passes, the memory lingered. Some cursed the tube forever, refusing to trust it again. Others who had seen a rocket blast a tank apart in a sudden miracle of fire clung to the belief that with time, training, and better rockets, this strange weapon could become the equalizer it was meant to be. From the wreckage of misfires and the humiliation of captured weapons, a resolve grew stronger. America would not abandon the bazooka. It would refine it, mass-produce it, and send it back into the fight sharper than before. The failures of Torch and Kasserine were not the end of the story. They were the rough beginning, the hard lessons carved in sand and steel. The bazooka had stumbled onto the battlefield awkward and unreliable, but it had not been broken. Instead, its shaky debut became the foundation for the next chapter, where improvisation would give way to refinement, and the toy mocked by soldiers would begin to earn their trust. The failures were not the death of the weapon. They were the furnace that would forge it into something greater, preparing it for Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and beyond. What started as a gamble had survived its first trial by fire. Scarred, doubted, but still standing, the bazooka was ready to grow. Its failures, far from ending the story, became the very reason it would succeed. The failures of North Africa burned like scars across the memory of every soldier who had fumbled with damp rockets or watched sparks die in their launchers. But out of those humiliations came pressure that could not be ignored. The Ordnance Department listened to the complaints from the front lines, dissected the after-action reports, and began the furious work of transforming the bazooka from a gamble into a true weapon of war. What had stumbled onto the beaches of Algeria half-formed would now be reforged. By mid-194, 3 new versions began to roll out. The M1, A1 replaced the flawed electrical contacts with sturdier components. The rockets, now redesigned as the M6A1 and later M6A3, featured better seals and a blunt nose to prevent glancing deflections. These weren't just technical tweaks, they were lifelines. Every improvement carried the weight of men's lives, and every field report hammered home the urgency of making the weapon dependable. Where the original had been fragile, the new designs promised resilience. Training also shifted dramatically. No longer would soldiers unbox their weapons under fire with no guidance. At Fort Benning, Captain Franklin Johnson demonstrated that an ordinary recruit could be taught to use the bazooka in a single afternoon. 2 hours with a handful of practice rounds, and a farm boy from Iowa could become a tank killer. This simplicity was the true genius of the design. Anti-tank guns required weeks, sometimes months, to master. But the bazooka, light enough to sling over a shoulder, was intuitive. Soldiers began to trust it not as a burden, but as a shield against the nightmare of advancing armor. And as trust grew, so did confidence. The men who had once joked bitterly about throwing rockets by hand now drilled in pairs, moving like predators through ruins and hedgerows. 2-man teams learned to fire from second-story windows, to stalk tanks in alleys, to strike from ditches at ranges where armor once ruled supreme. The bazooka was no longer a symbol of failure. It was becoming the equalizer, the weapon that turned hunted men into hunters. The proof came in Sicily. On July 10, 1,943 American paratroopers and infantry stormed the island in Operation Husky. The improved bazookas were in their hands now, and though the terrain was harsh and the German opposition fierce, the weapon began to earn its reputation. Near Biscari, a team from the 82nd Airborne Division achieved what seemed impossible, a direct hit on a Tiger tank. The rocket punched through the driver's vision slot, one of the few vulnerable points on the steel monster. It was a shot of extraordinary precision, more miracle than doctrine, but it carried an effect greater than the single kill. Word spread through the division like fire in dry grass. If a bazooka could kill a Tiger, then no tank was beyond reach. Colonel James Gavin, leading the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, summed it up bluntly in his report. The bazooka has given the American infantrymen confidence against enemy armor. In Sicily, we destroyed 17 German tanks with bazookas. The psychological effect exceeds even the physical destruction. That confidence mattered more than statistics. It meant that when the shadow of armor fell across a ridge or a village street, American infantry no longer scattered in panic. They stood their ground, raised their tubes, and fired back. The Germans noticed too. The war diary of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division for July 11th noted enemy infantry equipped with rocket weapons capable of destroying armor at 100 to 150 meters. Tank commanders must exercise increased caution in urban areas. A line of ink on paper, but behind it lay the reality that German tank crews could no longer rely on fear alone. The invincibility of the panzers had been cracked, and once cracked, the myth could not be repaired. Italy pushed the weapon further into versatility. In the rubble of medieval towns, infantry learned to use the bazooka, not just against tanks, but against the stone and steel of fortified buildings. They blasted holes through walls, creating shortcuts where streets were too dangerous. The Canadians called it mouse-holing, a brutal but effective tactic that turned the weapon into a tool for shaping the battlefield itself. In the December battle for Ortona, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division recorded that the bazooka proved invaluable in clearing houses and bunkers, smashing positions that rifles and grenades could not reach. The crude tube had become a key to urban warfare. By January 1944, bazookas were flowing into Europe at a staggering pace, 2,000 units per month. The M9 model, featuring a two-piece breakdown design for airborne use and a magneto-ignition system that eliminated the need for fragile batteries spread through divisions like wildfire. The blunt-nosed M6A3 rocket hit with more consistency and more devastating effect. Every infantry battalion now carried dozens of launchers. Every company had teams trained and ready. What had been a secret crate on a beach in 1942 was by now as common as the machine gun. The transformation was not just material, it was psychological. Where once American infantry had cowered before tanks, they now hunted them. Reports from the Fifth Army in Italy describe patrols moving with bazookas at the front, ready to ambush armor or collapse enemy strongpoints. Infantry schools recorded a new kind of doctrine, tank hunting. Soldiers were no longer drilled solely to avoid or endure armor. They were taught to stalk it, to fight it, to kill it. The change was profound. It was not only technology that had matured, but the spirit of the men who carried it. In every account, the tone had shifted. The weapon that had betrayed them in North Africa was now celebrated in Sicily and Italy. Soldiers trusted it. Commanders planned around it. The enemy feared it. The bazooka had stepped out of the shadow of failure and into the light of battlefield necessity. And yet, this was still only the beginning. The confidence it gave, the victories it carved, were merely preparation for the storms ahead. The hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the ruined streets of France and Germany, these would be the true tests, where the bazooka would not just prove itself, but reshape the very strategy of armored warfare. What began as an awkward experiment, doubted and derided, had now matured into a weapon of trust. From broken rockets and failed firings had risen a tool that every soldier believed, and a weapon that allowed them to look steel monsters in the eye without flinching. The bazooka was no longer just an invention. It had grown into a symbol of defiance, the weapon that promised that no tank, however mighty, would ever again advance without fear. And from that new faith, the next great chapter was waiting to be written. The bazooka had matured in Sicily and Italy, transforming from a fragile experiment into a weapon trusted by soldiers and feared by tank crews. But those victories were still preludes. The true measure of its power came when the weapon was deployed not in scattered battles but across the great campaigns that would decide the war. In these moments, the bazooka left behind the shadow of doubt forever and rose to its place as a weapon of strategy, shaping not just firefights, but entire doctrines of war. By June 6, 1944, as the Allies stormed Normandy, the bazooka was no longer a novelty. Thousands of launchers crossed the Channel alongside the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. The hedgerows of France, dense walls of earth and greenery, created natural fortresses where German armor could lurk unseen. But they also provided perfect hunting grounds for bazooka teams. In the weeks following D-Day, American records showed that 12% of German armor losses in the U.S. sector were caused by bazookas. That figure may seem small, but it meant thousands of infantry squads, once helpless, could now stand toe-to-toe with panzers and win. German commanders recognized the change almost immediately. Diaries and directives from the Wehrmacht warned tank crews to avoid moving into villages or hedgerows without infantry screens. Training directives in late 1943 had already cautioned against exposing armor, but by Normandy those warnings had hardened into survival rules. Tanks were forbidden from advancing within 100 meters of uncleared buildings. Urban warfare, once a field of blitzkrieg dominance, became a nightmare of unseen ambushes. Every window, every hedgerow, every rubble-strewn alley might conceal a pair of American soldiers with tubes of steel ready to strike. The German response was desperate adaptation. Panzer crews welded spare track links and sandbags onto their hulls. Concrete slabs were bolted onto turrets. Side skirts and scherzen were issued to blunt the shaped charges. Zimmerit paste was applied to armor in the hope of warding off magnetic mines, but its symbolic presence also reflected a growing paranoia about infantry-carried weapons. In every case, weight increased, mobility slowed, and maintenance became harder. The panzers that had once roared across open plains were now lumbering beasts, weighed down not by their own design, but by the fear of a weapon that cost less than a bicycle. Industry told another story. America's factories, decentralized and relentless, were producing bazookas and rockets in numbers that dwarfed anything Germany could hope to match. By August 1944, over 4,000,000 launchers had been built, with millions of rockets flooding the supply chains. The German answer, the Panzerschreck, technically superior, with its 88mm warhead, demanded more resources, more labor, and more time. Production records show just under 3,000,000 Panzerschrecks completed by war's end. The numbers told the truth. America could put 2 bazookas into the hands of its infantry for every 1 Panzerschreck the Germans managed to produce. And unlike Germany's centralized, vulnerable factories, America's war production sprawled across dozens of states immune to being crippled by a single bombing raid. The strategic shift was undeniable. In 1940, tanks had led the way, their treads carving open fronts for infantry to pour through. By 1944, the very concept of independent armor was dead. German armored units could no longer thrust forward with shock and speed, because every advance risked ambush by teams carrying simple tubes. Field Marshal Kesselring admitted in interrogation after the war that rocket launchers had forced a complete rethink of German armored tactics, where once speed had been strength, now caution became necessity. Every battle slowed, every advance costlier, every maneuver shackled by the threat of 2 soldiers hidden with a bazooka. And for the infantrymen, the change was profound. Reports from Normandy and the Ardennes describe a psychological reversal. Before, the bazooka tanks had been objects of terror. Men spoke of tank panic, the helpless dread of hearing treads clatter and engines roar. Now squads hunted armor. They trained in stalking tactics, flanking maneuvers, coordinated ambushes. In the hedgerows, teams crawled through the earth, rising suddenly to fire at a panther's vulnerable side or rear. In villages, they waited on upper floors, aiming at vision slits and turret rings. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, men wrapped rockets in their coats to keep propellants warm, then emerged like ghosts to cripple advancing panzers. The hunter-prey dynamic of war had been inverted. The infantryman was no longer prey. He was the predator. One account from the 99th Infantry Division during the Battle of the Bulge tells of Technical Sergeant Donald Bracken destroying a panther with a single shot to its engine deck. The crew abandoned the burning hulk, the fear of fire overtaking their training. That moment was repeated across the front lines. Bazookas didn't just kill tanks. They unmade the myth of invincibility that German armor had carried since Poland and France. The sight of a tank crew scrambling from a burning vehicle was more powerful than any statistic, and for every infantry squad that witnessed it, the message was clear: the panzers could bleed. The bazooka's influence extended beyond the battlefield into the very economics of war. A Sherman tank cost $75,000 to build. A German Tiger, nearly $100,000. A bazooka with 10 rockets cost barely over $100. For the price of 1 tank, America could arm thousands of men with weapons capable of halting armor. The asymmetry was staggering, and it tilted the balance of industrial warfare. Germany built brilliance in steel, but America built numbers in simplicity, and in war, numbers often prevail. By late 1944, the bazooka was not just a weapon, but a cornerstone of Allied infantry doctrine. It shaped patrol tactics, defensive ambushes, and offensive assaults alike. From the ruins of Aachen to the snow of the Ardennes, from hedgerows to city streets, its presence was constant. German war diaries confessed the dread every hedgerow may conceal rockets. Panzer crews hesitated, infantry advanced, and the rhythm of battle shifted. The bazooka's rise to prominence was not only a story of firepower, but of transformation. It had reshaped how armies fought, how tanks were built, and how soldiers saw themselves. The failures of North Africa had given way to the triumphs of Normandy and beyond, and with every rocket fired, a new future was being written. Because what the bazooka proved was more than tactical. It proved that in modern war, simplicity wielded by the many could defeat complexity held by the few. And that truth did not end with World War II. It pointed forward, hinting at a new age where every infantryman would carry the means to challenge steel giants. From the hedgerows of France to the jungles and deserts, yet to come, the shadow of the bazooka stretched far beyond the war it was born into. Its greatest impact was not only in the tanks it destroyed, but in the seeds it planted, the new doctrines it inspired, and the certainty it gave to every soldier who once trembled at the sound of treads. The weapon had reached its peak not just as a tool of the present, but as a promise of what warfare would forever become. The bazooka had reached its peak by the winter of 1944, shaping the very way the Germans fought and forcing the once dominant panzers into a cage of caution. But the story did not end with victory in Europe. The weapon's legacy stretched across oceans into new wars and into the very DNA of modern infantry doctrine. Its fire echoed far beyond the hedgerows of Normandy or the forests of the Ardennes, leaving a mark on every battlefield that came after. From the beginning, the weapon was never America's alone. Lend-Lease records show that thousands of launchers were shipped overseas, 8000 to the Soviet Union, 12000 to the United Kingdom, 15000 to Free French forces, and smaller but significant numbers to China and other allied nations. Each army found its own use for the simple tube. The Soviets, who already fielded anti-tank rifles, admired the bazooka's ease of use, but quickly pushed toward their own design, the RPG-2, a direct descendant of Uhl's improvised launcher. The British tested it, but their doctrine favored heavier anti-tank weapons, and yet even they admitted the portability made it invaluable in certain operations. The French carried it back into their homeland as both a symbol and a tool of liberation. In every hand, the bazooka carried the same promise that no soldier need face armor without hope. In the Pacific, the weapon carved another chapter. On the volcanic sands of Saipan and Iwo Jima, Marines found themselves not against swarms of panzers, but against fortified bunkers and caves carved into rock. Here, the bazooka proved its versatility. White phosphorus rockets lit up cave mouths, burning out defenders who thought themselves secure. Japanese tanks, though fewer and lighter than their German counterparts, fell to its blasts just the same. Marine records from Saipan noted 28 tanks destroyed by bazookas, but more telling were the countless bunkers cleared the tunnels, collapsed the positions, erased by a weapon that had once been mocked as a toy. It was no longer just an anti-tank tool, it was a universal key to the locked doors of the battlefield. The end of World War II did not erase its relevance. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, American infantry carried the M9A1 bazooka against Soviet-built T-34, divided by 85 seconds. At first, the old rockets failed their aged propellants and limited penetration, leaving the steel giants intact. Soldiers cursed again, much as they had in North Africa. But this time, the response was faster. Within 90 days, a new weapon arrived, the M20 Super Bazooka, with a 3.5-inch rocket that shattered T-34 seconds with a single hit. Sergeant Robert Bennett, fighting near Pusan, reported, "First shot, first kill at 125 yards. The weapon's evolution had proven its adaptability. What had begun as a scrap metal pipe now stopped the most modern tanks of its day. The principle outlived the weapon itself. The M72 Law, the AT-4, the Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, all carried the same DNA, portable man-operated shaped charge weapons. Designed to give infantry the means to destroy armor, the Soviets took the idea further, mass-producing the RPG-7, one of the most recognizable weapons in history, carried in conflicts across continents for decades. From Vietnam to Afghanistan to the Middle East, the basic idea of a soldier carrying a simple, powerful launcher traces back to that coat hanger site at Aberdeen. Every army in the modern world equips its infantry with some descendant of the bazooka. The concept became universal doctrine, but perhaps its greatest legacy lay not in steel or explosives, but in philosophy. The bazooka embodied America's industrial war-making creed, win not with perfection, but with simplicity and scale. The Germans had built masterpieces, the Tiger, the Panther machines of awe-inspiring engineering, but each one cost as much as a small town, each required months of labor and scarce materials. For every Tiger, America could build thousands of bazookas. And those thousands spread through every squad and every street did more than destroy tanks. They destroyed the very notion that armor could rule without fear. This was the true revolution, the democratization of firepower. No longer did the ability to kill a tank belong only to artillery crews or other tanks. It now belonged to the infantryman, the teenager in a foxhole, the farm boy who could be trained in 2 hours. That shift altered not just tactics, but psychology. The terror of tank panic dissolved into the confidence of tank hunting. And once given, that confidence could not be taken away. Even the enemy acknowledged it. German interrogations after the war reveal a consistent theme: the bazooka had forced a fundamental change in doctrine. Guderian himself admitted that armor could no longer act independently, that every advance now required infantry support and painstaking caution. What began as 2 men with a steel tube had undone the very essence of blitzkrieg, the doctrine that had once terrified the world. Looking back, the numbers tell the story starkly. Nearly 500,000 launchers produced, over 15 million rockets fired, costs so low that for the price of a single tank, an army could field thousands of launchers. But the real measure lies in the way the weapon reshaped war. It proved that industrial conflicts are not won by the most advanced weapon, but by the one that can be built fast, carried everywhere, and trusted by those who use it. The bazooka's story is the story of modern warfare itself. Born in desperation, mocked as crude, it matured into a weapon of fear and respect. It toppled myths, shifted strategies, and planted the seed for every modern anti-tank weapon that followed. From Normandy to Korea, from Saipan to Saigon, its shadow lingered, carried not in the steel of its tubes, but in the certainty it gave to the soldier's hand. And in the end, that is its true legacy. The bazooka proved that in the furnace of industrial war, victory does not always belong to brilliance but to simplicity wielded at scale. The Germans built the most fearsome tanks the world had seen, but they were slowed, burned, and abandoned because American teenagers carried a tube that cost less than a week's wages. That paradox is the enduring truth of the bazooka, that sometimes the weapon which changes history is not the most complex, but the simplest, the one that can be made by the thousands, carried by anyone, and fired in defiance against machines. Once thought unstoppable, it was more than a weapon. It was a promise that no soldier would ever again face steel monsters empty-handed. And in that promise lies its immortality, a legacy, written not only in the armor it pierced, but in the future it shaped, one rocket at a time. The story of the bazooka is not simply the tale of a weapon, but of a turning point in the history of war. Born from scrap metal and desperation, it rose from failure in North Africa to triumph in Normandy, from mockery to reverence, from fragile prototype to the foundation of modern infantry power. It forced the mighty panzers to crawl where once they had raced, compelled generals to abandon doctrines of shock and speed, and gave ordinary soldiers the courage to stand where before they would have fled. Its genius was not in perfection, but in simplicity, cheap to build, easy to use, and devastatingly effective when placed in the hands of millions. In the end, the bazooka was more than steel and explosives. It was an idea, a promise that no man on the battlefield would be left powerless before armored giants. Its descendants still shape the way armies fight today, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East. The bazooka proved that in an industrial war, victory belongs not to the most complex machine, but to the weapon that can be trusted, carried, and used by the many. It was democracy forged into steel, and it helped bring an empire of tanks to its knees.